Michael Crane, a 34-year-old documentary photographer, is used to long trips. His job is to capture rare stories and dark legends that many consider to be just rumors. This time his route was to Romania. The plane from New York landed in Bucharest, and after a few hours spent in a rented car, Michael found himself in a small village at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. The village seemed to be stuck in time. Narrow streets, crooked wooden fences, leaning houses with tiled roofs. Everything spoke of the old days. People here moved slowly, cautiously, as if they were afraid to disturb something invisible. Michael stopped the car near a bazaar selling handmade goods, vegetables, and rare herbs. The light smell of smoked cheese mixed with the aroma of dried berries. Women in long skirts and headscarves stood at the counters, and men were smoking pipes and talking quietly about something. Michael got out of the car, adjusted his backpack, and headed for the nearest counter. The vendor turned out to be an elderly woman with a deeply lined face and kind but wary eyes. "Good afternoon," Michael said in his broken Romanian. "Good afternoon," the woman replied, staring at him intently. Michael took out his phone and showed me a photo from a guidebook, an old temple with a facade scarred by time. "Do you know where it is?" The smile instantly disappeared from her face. She exchanged glances with her neighbor, a young woman in her 30s, who, as if frightened, quickly turned away. The old woman frowned and shook her head. "It's better not to go there, son. It's a bad place," she said. "Why? It's just an old temple." The old woman was silent, but then she whispered,
"Places are not just old. They can be cursed."
Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't believe in superstition, but the old woman's words sounded strangely convincing. He decided to change tactics. "I just want to take pictures," he said. "I'm a photographer. I'm interested in architecture." The woman shook her head and, taking his hand, squeezed it tightly with her bony fingers. "Architecture is not worth losing your soul." Her words were so soft that Michael barely heard them. Then she let go of his hand and turned away, making it clear that the conversation was over. Before Michael had gone far, he noticed a man in his 50s, dressed in a warm sweater and a hat, approaching him. His face was serious, but not hostile. "Are you looking for a temple?" he asked. Michael nodded, glad that he had finally found someone who was willing to talk.
"I can show you the way," the man continued. "But you have to be careful. This place is not for the weak."
"Why is everyone so afraid of this temple?" Michael asked bluntly. The man looked at him for a long time, as if assessing whether it was worth answering.
"This temple was closed many years ago. Since then, almost no one goes there. The locals believe that he is cursed. But if you want to get there, you'll need a map." He took a tattered piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Michael. A forest path leading to the temple was drawn on the map.
"Thank you," Michael said, studying the map carefully. The man did not answer, but only nodded, turned around and left. As Michael approached the car, he suddenly heard a voice. "You won't come back the way you were." He looked around, but there was no one in the bazaar. These words, spoken as if out of nowhere, echoed in his head, making him involuntarily think, what really awaits him in this temple? In the evening, after filling out his notebook with the first notes, Michael got into the car and headed for the woods. The dark clouds hanging over the Carpathian Mountains seemed to promise a thunderstorm, and there was a strange tension in the air. Michael set off early in the morning. The path indicated on the map was barely noticeable, narrow, overgrown with tall grass in places. The first hours of the journey seemed simple. The sun broke through the treetops. The forest was full of sounds, birds chirping, insects chirping. However, the deeper he went, the fewer signs of life remained around. The forest grew thicker, the trees taller and older. Moss hung from the branches, and their gnarled roots crawled out onto the path as if trying to grab the traveler. Michael stumbled constantly, almost falling several times. "Great place for tourists," he muttered to himself, trying to keep his spirits up. However, the internal discomfort was growing. The birds stopped singing, and the wind died down. It seemed that the forest suddenly froze, as if it was watching an uninvited guest. Involuntarily, Michael looked around. There's no one around. But he could feel the gaze. The mist began to spread across the ground, rising from the depths of the forest. Whitish and dense, it enveloped everything around, making the path seem like a maze. Michael checked the map, but now it seemed useless. Visibility had dropped to a few meters. It's just fog. It's normal in the mountains, he reassured himself, but his voice sounded strained. After several hours of wandering, Michael stopped in front of a steep climb. The forest parted, and a narrow path appeared in front of him, leading up the slope. As he struggled up the slippery rocks, he noticed a small village in the distance. It wasn't on the map. As Michael got closer, he was surprised by how quiet the place was. The village consisted of 5 or 6 houses with sagging roofs and peeling shutters. There were no animals or people in sight. However, he caught movement in one of the windows. Someone was looking at him. He knocked on the nearest door. Nothing happened for a few seconds, but then the door slowly opened. On the threshold stood a young guy, thin, with bright blue eyes, barely covered by long bangs. "Who are you? What is it?" he asked in broken English. "My name is Michael. I am a photographer from America. I'm trying to find a temple." The guy frowned, looking at him with obvious suspicion. "The temple? Why are you going there?" "I heard that this place is unusual. I want to document it." A strange expression flashed across the young man's face, a mixture of fear and sympathy. He looked down for a moment as if thinking, and then said softly, "You'd better not go there." "Why?" Michael took a step closer, hoping to get some information. "This temple..." The guy sighed heavily. "My grandmother said he was alive." "Those who enter there come back different, or they don't come back at all."
I'm not afraid, Michael replied firmly. I just need to take pictures.
The guy shrugged his shoulders, as if giving up on further attempts to dissuade him.
"If you want to go, go. But remember, if you hear crying, don't answer."
The words sounded so strange that Michael didn't immediately understand their meaning. "Whose is it?" But the guy had already closed the door, leaving him alone on a deserted street. As he climbed further into the mountains, Michael felt his anxiety grow. The fog was getting thicker, turning the path into a surreal corridor of gray smoke and black silhouettes of trees. Every sound, the crunching of a branch, the fall of a stone, reverberated in his mind, making him turn around. After about an hour of walking, he came to a small clearing. In the center was a wooden cross, entwined with wilted flowers. The name Magdalena, 1872, was burned into the plaque under the cross. Michael took a few photos, but a strange tremor in his hands made it impossible to concentrate. He felt a cold wind blowing. There was a faint, barely perceptible sound in his ears, like a child crying, but so quiet that it could be a deception of hearing. "It's just the wind," he assured himself, hurrying on. At sunset, Michael finally saw the temple. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, surrounded by dense trees. The ruined facade, covered in places with black mold, looked menacing. There was not a single sound around. Even the wind had died down. Michael took a step closer, and his heart skipped a beat. A face flashed by in one of the windows behind a cracked stained glass window. Michael stopped for a few seconds, trying to figure out if he was imagining things. The face that flashed through the window was pale as marble and disappeared too quickly for him to make out its features. Steeling himself, Michael approached the massive wooden doors of the temple. They looked like they could crumble into dust with a single blow. With difficulty, he opened the doors and went inside. The temple was in semi-darkness. The rays of the setting sun barely penetrated the cracked stained glass windows, casting bizarre, distorted shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, as if it hadn't been touched in centuries. Michael froze, struck by the grandeur and desolation of the place. High vaults, dilapidated frescoes on the walls, dusty wooden benches. All this spoke of the former glory of the temple. But now there was only desolation and silence. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor. He noticed candles at the altar, which, despite the general condition of the temple, burned with a steady flame. Someone has definitely been here recently. But who? At that moment, a dull sound broke the silence, as if someone had slowly closed a heavy door. Michael whirled around and saw him. In the far corner of the temple, in the shadows, stood a man. Dressed in a black robe, tall and thin, he seemed to be part of the darkness surrounding the room. The abbot. His face, framed by gray hair, was stern, and his eyes shone with insight.
Why are you here? The old man's voice was low and unexpectedly loud, as if it had shattered on the walls. I've heard that this temple is unusual. Michael forced a smile, but it immediately faded under the abbot's hard gaze. The old man slowly walked closer, leaning on a heavy wooden staff. He stopped at arm's length, his eyes, gray and cold, studying Michael intently. You shouldn't be here, he finally said.
I don't understand. It's just a temple. I wanted to...
Just a temple? The abbot interrupted him. Go away while you still can. Michael felt the blood rush to his face. He was always annoyed by the closeness of such people, their unwillingness to share a story, especially when it could be interesting for his work.
Listen, Father.
Father John, the old man clarified. Father John, I traveled halfway around the world to see this place. I've heard about his miracles. Myrrh streaming icons, people are talking about it. Why are you hiding everything? The old man suddenly stopped talking. His face was set in stone, but Michael saw something flash in his eyes. Fear? Anger? Or pain? There was no response. Instead, John slowly turned around and, without saying another word, walked to the altar. You don't understand. People want to know. Michael shouted, but his voice was lost in the walls. John stopped at the altar, turned around and stared at him. His face became stern, almost menacing.
If you stay here, I won't be able to protect you, he said with cold firmness. Go away.
After these words, he turned away and headed for the door leading to the side of the temple. A few seconds later, the door closed behind him with a loud creak, leaving Michael alone in silence. He remained standing, confused. Don't protect me from what? He thought. Annoyance from this mysterious conversation was gradually replaced by curiosity. Michael knew that he wasn't going to leave so easily. The feeling that he was close to solving something important was too strong to ignore. He slowly approached the altar. At first, Michael didn't notice anything unusual, but then his gaze settled on one of the icons. Saint Nicholas, carved on an old, darkened tree. The saint's face was stern, with deep wrinkles and clear eyes. For a moment, Michael felt as if the saint's eyes were watching him. Michael raised his camera to take a picture, but suddenly felt a cold breeze, even though the doors and windows were closed. He looked around sharply, but saw nothing. The temple was empty again, and the silence was deafening. If I leave now, I'll never know the truth, he whispered to himself, deciding that he would return here at night. Night fell on the mountains, shrouding the temple in thick darkness. The moon, pale and alarmingly bright, illuminated the ruined walls and creaking doors. Michael, hiding in the woods nearby, waited for the light in the windows to stop flickering. Probably the abbot had gone to his chambers. Michael carefully made his way to the main entrance. The doors, which had been difficult to open during the day, now opened with unexpected ease, as if they invited him inside. The air inside was thick and damp, with a slight metallic taste, like a reminder of something ancient and gloomy. There was almost complete silence, except for the occasional howl of wind through the cracks in the walls. He lit a flashlight, pointing it at the rows of old icons covered with dust and cobwebs. A ray of light slid across the faces of the saints, and it suddenly seemed to Michael that their eyes were following him. The icon of St. Nicholas, which stood in the center of the altar, was especially attractive. The saint's face was filled with stern solemnity, and his arms were outstretched in benediction. Michael came closer, his heart beating faster, as if he expected something unusual to happen. He could smell the faint scent of iron. Strange and harsh, it became stronger as Michael approached the icon. And then he noticed a dark, thick liquid was flowing down the saint's cheek. She glittered in the light of the flashlight, as if she had just appeared. Blood. Michael froze. He slowly ran his hand over his face, as if trying to make sure it wasn't a trick of the light or his imagination. But it was real. 2 more drops appeared on the icon, which slowly trickled down. He turned around, shining his flashlight on the other icons. Tears of blood appeared on all of them. The drops fell to the floor, leaving scarlet spots on the stone. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, a strange sound filled the air. Quiet as a faint echo, it gradually grew louder. Michael froze, listening. It was crying, childish, shrill, and polyphonic. It didn't come from one direction. It seemed to come from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air. "Damn it," Michael whispered, feeling his breathing become ragged. He took a few steps back, barely feeling his legs. At that moment, the light of the flashlight picked out a figure from the shadows. The abbot stood in front of him. His face, which had been stern during the day, now looked like it was carved out of stone. "I warned you," Father John said. His voice sounded hollow, like a bell striking. Michael wanted to say something, but he couldn't. His lips wouldn't move. The abbot took a step forward, and the flashlight in Michael's hand wavered, illuminating his face. There was something dark, deep, and unnatural in the old man's gray eyes. "What's going on here?" Michael finally managed. John was silent for a while, then sighed heavily and said, "You saw something you shouldn't have seen." Michael shook his head sharply, his fear replaced by sudden anger. "Enough secrets! I'm not leaving until I find out what it all means. These tears, this crying." The abbot raised his hand for silence. His face became gloomy, and his voice became even lower. "Okay. Did you want the truth? I'll tell you. But be prepared. After what you've heard, you'll never be the same again." The old man pointed his staff at the altar. "It all started here, many years ago, and it's still going on. Do you think you found a temple? No, Michael. You found a place of pain." The abbot walked to the altar, his staff thudding on the stone floor with every step. He stopped in front of the icon of St. Nicholas, turning to face Michael. In the semi-darkness, his figure seemed menacing, and his voice, now drowned out by the loud echo of a child's crying, sounded as if from another world. "This temple was built more than 200 years ago," John began, and there was anger and pain in his voice. "It served as a refuge for all who needed salvation. Sinners came here for forgiveness, the exhausted for comfort. But one day, darkness came here." Michael took a step closer, his hands still shaking. "What kind of darkness?" "What is it?" he whispered, although he hardly expected to get an answer. The abbot looked at him, and there was something painful in his eyes, as if he saw this darkness every day. "Maria," he said the name like a curse. "She was the abbess here many years ago. People considered her a holy woman, but there was greed in her heart. She didn't save souls. She destroyed them." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat, but he didn't interrupt. Young women from the surrounding villages came to Maria for help. Girls who got pregnant without a husband. In those days it was a disgrace, a death to their reputation, and she promised them deliverance from sin. John closed his eyes, as if struggling with memories. But instead of mercy, she brought death. Michael listened, unable to move. In the basement of the temple, under the altar, Mary created her dark kingdom. She performed abortions where prayers were supposed to be performed. Terrible, painful, dirty. Many of the girls died from wounds and infections. But even those who survived remained cursed. They never forgot the screams of their unborn children. Michael felt his hands turn icy cold. But the most terrible thing is the souls of babies, John continued. His voice got quieter, but that made it even scarier. They didn't have time to see the light. We didn't have time to breathe. They stayed here, trapped within these walls. Michael swallowed, feeling the cold constrict his throat. And Maria? What happened to her? I'm sorry, he said. The abbot lowered his head for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. She's been exposed, he finally said. One of the priests found out what was going on in the basement and brought people from the village with him. They wanted to put her on trial, but Maria ran away. She was hiding in the woods. She was found a few days later, on the very cliff behind the temple. She jumped down. Michael felt his stomach twist. After her death, everything changed. The icons began to cry blood. The temple has become different. People who came in here heard babies crying. They lost their minds or died. At that moment, the crying around them became louder. Michael felt the sound seeping into his head, burning his consciousness. It wasn't just a sound. It was a cry of pain, despair, endless longing. Are they crying? Are these children? Michael felt his throat go dry. John nodded. Their souls are trapped here. They will never find peace. It's their blood you see on the icons. Their pain, their rage. Michael put his head in his hands, trying to protect himself from the rising sound. Why aren't you trying to do something? Why do you just live here? The abbot looked at him with an expression Michael would never forget, a mixture of impotent anger and resignation. I'm staying here to keep these souls from getting out. If the temple falls, if the walls collapse, they can gain freedom. But they won't become angels, Michael. These souls are filled with hatred, and if they come out, their screams will cover the whole world. Michael took another step back, trying to process what he'd just heard. But the crying grew louder, and it seemed as if the walls of the temple were shrinking. He felt his own thoughts drown in the sound. You can hear them, John suddenly said, staring at him intently. At that moment, Michael actually heard. Individual voices stood out from the general crying. It seemed to him that babies were whispering right in his ears, calling his name, accusing him, begging for help. Kill her! Kill her! The voice was shrill, like a knife cutting through consciousness. Why are you here? Why did you leave us? Save us! Michael covered his ears, screaming, but it didn't help. He fell to his knees, his body shaking, and the screams grew louder. A sound that was impossible to hide from, as if ripping off his mind layer by layer. John stood motionless. His gaze remained cold. Now you understand. The temple chose you. Michael struggled to his feet. His body was shaking like a taut string, and his head was buzzing with endless crying. He stepped back, stumbling, but bumped into a cold stone wall. The sounds that filled the air became stronger, louder, as if the souls of the babies had noticed that they were being heard and were now rushing to him. Get it away from me! Stop it! He shouted, turning to the abbot. John stood motionless, like a statue, leaning on his staff. His face remained cool. Now you understand, he repeated. They're always here, crying, screaming. No one can save them because they haven't had time to find their souls. It's not true, Michael shouted, trying to convince not only the abbot, but also himself. It's just a damn place. It's acoustics, gases from the ground, an illusion. John looked at him as if his words meant nothing.
You can deny it, but they chose you. You can hear them now, and you'll never forget them.
Michael felt his body panic. He turned to the door and started running, but as soon as he took a step, the sound began to change. The crying of the babies became a barely audible whisper. "Don't go away," the voices said. "Help us." They were getting louder. Michael stopped, breathing heavily. It seemed as if a whisper was seeping into his mind, taking possession of him. For a moment, he felt a strange feeling, a mixture of pity and guilt.
"Why me?"
he whispered, looking at John.
"Why did they choose me?"
The abbot looked at him with a slight sadness. "You saw their blood. You heard them crying. Now you're connected to this place."
"But I don't want to be tied up."
"It's not your choice anymore," John snapped. The crying stopped abruptly. There was such silence that for a moment Michael thought he was deaf. But this was no ordinary silence. It was as if she was squeezing her chest, preventing her from taking a breath. Michael slowly turned towards the altar. The icons that used to cry tears of blood now looked even more frightening. Their faces seemed alive, and their eyes seemed to be looking directly at him. In the center is St. Nicholas. His face was now contorted into a grimace that Michael couldn't describe. Anger? Pain? Or something else? "What do I do now?" Michael gasped. John did not answer. He just pointed to the stairs leading down to the basement. "You have to go down there."
"What? What for?"
Michael shook his head in shock. "Because if you don't see it through, the temple will never let you go." The abbot's words sounded like a sentence. Michael wanted to protest, to run away, but something inside him made him take a step towards the stairs. He turned on the flashlight and slowly began to descend. The basement was even colder than the upper temple. A narrow, stone-lined corridor led deeper into the room. Rotten wooden tables and metal tools lined the walls, old, rusty, but still recognizable. Michael felt his stomach turn over. "This is where it all happened," he said softly to himself. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and then went out. Michael froze in absolute darkness. And then he heard crying again. But now it was closer, louder. It seemed that the babies surrounded him, their screams beat in his ears, and their voices whispered directly into his brain. "You are our savior. Save us. Or stay with us." Michael screamed. His voice merged with a child's crying. At that moment, he felt something cold touch his hand. He jerked it away, but suddenly a heavy hand fell on his shoulder.
"You've seen enough,"
John's voice came from right behind him. Michael turned around, but the abbot was standing at the other end of the corridor. The palm disappeared. "What's going on here?" Michael shouted over the noise. John did not move. All he said was, "This place is their prison. And now you're part of it too." Michael ran, not seeing the road. His feet clung to the rocks. His hands scraped against the walls. But he continued to rush forward until, finally, he flew to the surface. The night greeted him with an icy wind, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. When he turned around, the temple was gone. Just a blackening cliff at the edge of the mountain and the whistling of the wind. Michael lay there, feeling the emptiness grow inside him. The crying no longer sounded, but a whisper remained in his head forever. "We'll find you.